Joshua chapter 7, the story of Achan's sin. Following the tremendous victory over Jericho, we move on to chapter 7, the next stage in the Israelite assault to conquer the land. But this story, as its heading suggests, has a very different ending, at least in its first stage. It is in fact a failure on the part of the Israelites. And I think this is a fine instance where we see how the Bible is not just history. It doesn't parallel whatsoever the findings we have from the ancient Near East and other places, royal annals that basically depict all the successes of kings and were obviously written as propaganda to aggrandize and show off the greatness of the king. The Bible is very much not that. It's not history per se. It's based on history, but it uses history to teach us lessons. And just as we can learn from the successes, we also learn from the failures. And this is indeed what we find here in the book of Joshua, not only a list of successes on the part of the Israelites, but also failures. And this is the instance, chapter 7, the story of the failure of the Israelites. Now, of course, this is quite shocking, particularly after the great success in Jericho. And the author of the story did not want to leave us, right, without any background to this upcoming demise. And therefore, he preempts by hinting that things are amiss and trouble is ahead. So let us begin with reading the opening verses of the story of Joshua chapter 7, the story of Achan. And the children of Israel committed a trespass in the consecrated thing. Okay, this is a verb, the Hebrew vayimalu ma'al, right? A trespass. It's not just stealing, but it's transgressing something which was supposed to be beyond bounds. So the children of Israel committed a trespass in the consecrated thing. For Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerach, of the tribe of Judah. We have a very long lineage here, the pedigree of this Achan. He took of the consecrated things, right? This is a translation of the verb, the cherem, things that were banned, right? They were consecrated to God. So he took of the consecrated things, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against the children of Israel. So we open up with a description of a sin which was committed. It wasn't mentioned in the previous chapter of the conquest, which was meant to show a very positive view and indeed a great outcome of how the Israelites overcome their enemy in the first conquest beyond the Jordan River. But here we are informed that not all was rosy. Somebody did transgress that prohibition of not taking anything from the booty of the war. If you recall, we discussed how basically the Israelites did not gain anything from that war. They couldn't take slaves because they had to destroy and annihilate the people. They couldn't take any wealth that was also destroyed or consecrated to the Lord. They couldn't even use the land, right? But we are informed that somebody did take from the spoils, this Achan. So this is background, right? It's background for what's about to happen, also background for specific events later on in the chapter when we will try to uncover who perpetrated. We have to remember, we as readers are informed of this, but Joshua does not know. So we continue in verses 2 and 3. And Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is beside Beit Aven, on the east side of Beit El, and spoke to them, saying, "Go up and spy out the land." and the men went up and spied out Ai. So now Joshua directs spies to gather military intelligence for the next upcoming battle, just like he did, preempting his battle against Jericho when he sent the two spies who eventually reached the house of Rahav in Joshua chapter 2. Once again, Joshua sends spies, this time to the next target, and that is the town of Ai. The town of Ai, as we're informed here, is east of Bethel. It's already mentioned in the book of Genesis. In fact, Genesis chapter 12, with Abraham's arrival into the land. So he comes in from the north from Shechem and then goes down to the center of the land. We see in verse 8 in chapter 12, and he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent. Bethel was to the west, and Ai was to the east. So here again, we see that same location, Ai mentioned, to the east of Bethel, but in the mountain area. So if we take a look at a map here, taking this from Bible Maps, we can see they cross the Jordan River. You can see the Jordan River. And their first attack was on Jericho, right? Very close to the Jordan River. Now they target from Jericho, they want to move on to Ai, not a definite identification, there are different opinions, right? One of the opinions was pretty much rejected, but the location is clear, even if we don't have a definite identification of the mound itself, Ai, or the meaning of the word Ai, which was also contemplated. But we see here, it is to the east of Bethel, somewheres north of Jerusalem, north of Hebron and all this area. Basically, nowadays, Bethel is located close to the Ramallah area, around 17 kilometers north of Jerusalem. So we're talking a little east of that area. Joshua decides, and it's pretty much parallel to Jericho. So he's infiltrating eastwards. Why does he decide to attack specifically the Ai, this location, which is a small town, as we'll hear later on? There are bigger areas, right, that he may have chosen to attack. Why not go straight for Jerusalem or Hebron or Shechem or other cities? This was proposed as an explanation by a professor, Elitzur, Yehuda Elitzur, of blessed memory, who tried to analyze the strategy involved here. And he said that we can see Joshua trying to basically make a cut through the land, right, from Jericho to Ai, with the intention of dividing the land and splitting between north and south. Israel in general is a narrow sliver of land, but it has some length north and south. And basically Joshua's plan was apparently to cut connections between north and south and take on each separately, which we will see indeed is what happened. So that's why strategically it was important to draw this buffer zone between north and south, and therefore Joshua continues infiltrating eastwardly into the mountain range to attack the Ai. So he sends his spies there to gather intelligence, just like he did with Jericho. And verse 3, and they returned to Joshua and said to him, do not let all the people go up. In other words, don't tarry all the people to go up the mountain. It's a steep climb up from the Jordan Valley, right, the lowest point on earth, up to the mountain. So he says, the spies say, don't tarry all the people, but let about 2,000 or 3,000 men go up and smite Ai. Do not trouble all the people there, for they are but few. Basically, the spies give a confident report. They say unnecessary to bring all our soldiers, 2,000 or 3,000, that will suffice for this small town. So this kind of parallels the upbeat report also of the previous spies, the spies of Joshua that were sent to Jericho. We look at the end of the chapter, chapter 2, right? They report back to Joshua as well, and they said to Joshua, chapter 2, verse 24, for the Lord has delivered into our hands all the land, and also the inhabitants of the country have melted away because of us. So here too, we have a very positive, confident, right, report of the spies, with of course one minor difference. Not what is said as much as what is not. The spies of Jericho attributed the definite upcoming victory to God, right? For the Lord has delivered into our hands all the land. Whereas in our case, they return no mention of the Lord, just total confidence, apparently confidence based on their numerical advantage, right? This is a small town, and therefore it's a piece of cake. We totally outnumber them. No need to have the whole army attack, as in the case of Jericho, which was a big central city. Here it's a small town and no problems for us whatsoever. Now, whenever there's great confidence on the part of Israel, usually that is a sign of upcoming trouble. They usually fare quite well as underdogs, but when they're the favorites, sometimes this leads actually to their demise when we see some overconfidence. And here we can see some cockiness and overconfidence on the part of the spies who were sent up to the eye. So Joshua received the report, right? And then he moves on to attack the eye. We understood the strategy. And now let us read in the following two verses the outcome. So there went up there of the people about 3,000 men, and they fled before the men of Ai. And the men of Ai smote of them about 36 men, and they chased them from before the gate to Shebarim. Right, it's probably where the areas of the mountain break, Shavar, that's Shvarim, and smote them in the descent, right, going down probably easterly where the mountains slowly become lower and break down, right? And the hearts of the people melted and became as water. So we see the outcome, defeat. Not only defeat, but about 36 men also fall in this combat, right? And we see the outcome also as far as the morale of the people. The hearts of the people melted and became as water. The first thing I want to relate to is that peculiar description of about 36, right, people who fell. What is that, about 36? That sounds like a very specific number. The sages in a midrashic, homiletic direction said, oh, this is not an approximation, but rather saying that somebody died who is worthy of being like counted as 36 people. And why 36? Because that is beyond half of the great judicial system, the Sanhedrin, which functioned during the time of the sages. They numbered 70, so you have a majority was with 36. So somebody who's even, a majority would be considered as an individual a majority, right, in the great court, the Sanhedrin. This is, of course, totally not pshat, but rather homiletical. They even suggest a name, the name Yair ben Menashe. But on the pshat level, we have to search for an alternative explanation. One such is that maybe this is evidence of the use of a sexagesimal numerical system, meaning a numerical system that is founded and based on the number 60. This was common in ancient Mesopotamia, Sumerian culture, which also continued into Babylonian culture, and they counted with 60 as the base. It's, by the way, still used in certain respects, like even in our time, for example, time, right? 60 minutes. And also with regard to degrees, we have like 360 degrees, right? So we sometimes see the usage of 60 as a central number. So maybe this is an approximation, about 36, which would be like a round number in a system. Of course, this is a 6 system, not a 60 system, but an approximation. We don't really find that often, all right, this usage. We sometimes see like the usage of number 12 tribes, right? We see sometimes in the Bible the usage of like 600,000 soldiers coming out of Egypt, but it's not that prominent, definitely not the usage of number 36. So it's a possibility, but I'm not sure how likely it is. I prefer going more in a literary direction. I see here a literary motif, because if we remember that small word about, right? In Hebrew, it is just one letter, ki shloshim v'shisha, about 36 men. I think we might have some literary irony here. And this may be a direct, basically response to the report of the spies. Because if you remember, what did the spies say? Do not let, in verse 3, do not let all the people go up, but let about 2,000 or 3,000 men, right? That's a translation of that same one letter, ki shloshet alafim ish, right? About 2,000 or about 3,000. So it could be that this is kind of like an echo, an ironic, sardonic kind of a rebuttal to the words of the spies. You say, oh, about 2,000, about 3,000 doesn't really matter. I'll show you how things don't really matter. I'll give you about 36 fatalities, right? That fall. And you'll see how every human being is so important, so painful. And indeed, we see the effect on the people, how they are totally shocked, dumbfounded, and despondent, right? Losing all, right, of their confidence. And indeed, it's interesting because the description of their hearts melting kind of echoes what we saw in the final report of the spies to Jericho, who, right, reported that the hearts of all the people of Jericho are melting, right? And that's what Rahab said as well in chapter 2. It was verse 11, I believe. Let's take a look. Right here she says, and as soon as we heard, our hearts melted. Right, this is Rahab speaking to the spies in Jericho. So here we see, whereas in the beginning, the hearts of the residents of Canaan all melted, now we see the opposite happening. After the Israelites lose, their hearts melt, and they are totally despondent. The big question, of course, from a moral perspective that arises is, how do we explain the consequence of 36 soldiers dying due to the sin of one person, Achan? Right? What kind of justice is this? If Achan sinned, so let him die, let him be punished. But why does this have to affect, right, the whole nation? Now, we may already hear some hints to this in the opening verse. There's something interesting, because take a look at the formulation. And the children of Israel committed a trespass, for Achan, the son of Kamri, etc., took of the consecrated thing. Right, so it begins in the plural. Committed a trespass. This is all the children of Israel. The Hebrew is the plural of vayimalu in plural. And then we move on to a singular vayikach, and he took. So we got here a play between all of Israel as if they transgressed, whereas the actual action described is in the singular only once. So how do we explain this phenomenon of all of Israel suffering a defeat as a nation for the sin of one individual? This may be representative of the concept of what's called corporate solidarity in the modern research on this story, right? The view that all the people are viewed as one entity, right? And therefore judged. Even if there's one person sinning, it has an effect on everyone. It's like everyone's in the same boat. So if even one person drills a hole in the boat goes down and brings everybody down with them. So here, maybe that's exactly what we see happening. God is judging all of Israel as an entity. And even if it's only certain individuals, it's affecting the whole lot. Still, that, of course, leaves us with some difficulty, but it might relate to divine justice. But maybe the verse that starts off by describing all of Israel trespassing, transgressing, maybe hints that it wasn't only Achan. Maybe Achan was an extreme example. Perhaps others partook. In any event, what we could clearly see is that not only does the story anticipate the downfall by describing the sin of Achan in the first verse, it also gives us two other verses with the report of the spies, which I think also anticipate the downfall. There's a sense of overconfidence and absence of mentioning God. So maybe the sin here of Achan is actually transgressing and taking from the spoils, but all of Israel has some accounting to do for perhaps being overconfident and forgetting the source of their power and victory, not mentioning God in the response of the spies. So we will return to our reading of the verses. So this is Joshua's response, verse 6. And Joshua rent his clothing and fell to the earth upon his face before the ark of the Lord until the evening, he and the elders of Israel, and they put dust upon their heads, so they fall down, right, and show signs of grieving. And Joshua said, "Woe, Lord God, why have you at all brought this people over the Jordan to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites, to cause us to perish? Would that we had been content and dwelt on the other side of the Jordan." So Joshua is saying, why did you bring us over the Jordan? We could have stayed to the east. We would have been happy there. We already conquered that area. We don't need to come to the west and then only suffer defeat and perish. These words remind us to a certain extent of what the Israelites said in response to the spies in the time of Moses, where they said, we don't want to go into the land. They were too scared. They said, let us stay here. Let us go back to Egypt. So it's interesting. Now this is Joshua, who's totally shocked, right? He doesn't know. He didn't see this coming at all. And with such confidence, after divine help in conquering Jericho, suddenly this defeat against a small town, he's shocked. He's in grief. He's despondent. He says, why did you bring us here at all? We should have just stayed on the other side of the Jordan. I continue in verse 8. Pray, O Lord, what shall I say after Israel has turned their backs before their enemies, have fled? For the Canaanites and all the inhabitants of the land shall hear and shall encircle us and cut off our name from the earth. Up till here, Joshua's concern is for the plight of the people of Israel. He said, what's our future? We're gonna be totally destroyed. But then he continues on. And what will you do for your great name? Now Joshua has another concern also. How does this affect the name of God? Joshua, as a God-fearing person, knows that as the leader of the people of Israel have a function to represent God. And now what happens to God's name when the Israelites are defeated. This will totally downgrade the status of God. This is something that we've heard also in the time of Moses, where Moses said, "What will everybody say if you wipe out your people? What will they say about what will happen to your great name?" So Joshua uses that same argument, but he basically bounces a bunch of questions to God. He doesn't know what to do now. Where are we headed now? Now we move on to the response of God to all these questions that Joshua raised. So we begin reading verse 10. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Get up. Why do you fall upon your face?" And we'll see this word, this root, get up, in Hebrew, kum, which will be the dominant word in the response of God to all the questions and queries that Joshua had. Now we can see in God's response, not only does he tell Joshua, get up, but he also responds with a rhetorical question. Why do you fall upon your face? In other words, God responds to all the questions that Joshua had with a question of his. Why are you doing this? Why are you now in a state of mourning and grief? That's not the appropriate response. Get up. And now he informs him what we know as readers, but Joshua didn't. Israel has sinned, and they have also transgressed my covenant. Right? Take a look at that verb. Avru, translated here, transgressed. Right? Avru et briti, transgressed my covenant. Like we said, Achan did not only steal things that do not belong to him, but this is a transgression of a covenant. And there's also irony in the usage of that verb avar, which literally means to cross over, to pass over, right? Avru et briti, they have passed over my covenant. They have crossed over my covenant, taken literally. Because that verb avar, to pass over, was a central verb in chapters 3 and 4, the story of the crossing of the Jordan River. Right, that was a key word in chapter 3. It appears 9 times. We can see here the end of chapter 3, verse 14. Right, la'avor et hayarden, to cross the Jordan. Also in verse 15, right, the end. And the people passed over opposite Jericho, crossed over. And the summary, 17, right. And all Israel passed over on dry ground until the whole nation had completely passed over the Jordan. That same verb, over, right? Ein bet resh. They passed over, right? It's dominant 9 times within the chapter. And here, after they crossed over the Jordan, miraculously, now that word reappears. But here they have crossed over, namely transgressed the covenant, haven't kept all the rules, right? So we see a turnabout in all the events here. So, and look at how many verbs are used in verse 11 to describe, right, the sin of the people. Israel has sinned, right? Once again, notice it's referring to all of Israel. And they have transgressed my covenant, right? Chata avru, transgressed my covenant, which I commanded them. And they have also taken of the consecrated thing, and have also stolen, and also dissembled, and they have also put into their vessels. Right? We have a general description here. You can see 6 verbs, right, describing the sin, right? Avru, chata, avru, lakhu, ganvu, kichashu, samu b'kleihem. All the verbs translated in verse 11, also to show how serious the transgression is here, right? Additionally, this is from a literary perspective also further emphasized with the repetition of the word and, gam here. Look how many times it appears. Vegam. They also did this. Vegam avod, from the beginning of the verse. Vegam avod briti. Vegam lakhu. And again, vegam, third time. Fourth time, vegam, fifth time. Right? Translate and, right? Like something becoming even, more severe, and one sin on top of another, right? All this describing the severity of the event. And the description of God continues after informed that the Israelites sin. And the children of Israel shall not be able to stand. We have that verb lakum, to stand up. They shall not be able to stand before their enemies. They will turn their backs before their enemies because they have become accursed. This is the idea they've become, in the Hebrew, kiayu lecherem. They have been banned. They have become, cherem is something which is set aside, banned, condemned to destruction, or devoted to God. So now, because they have taken from what was banned, they themselves have become banned. I would prefer, as opposed to accursed. They become banned, right? I will not be with you anymore if you do not destroy the consecrated thing. That's a translation of that same word, cherem, the banned, consecrated thing from among you. So basically, God says they have taken from the banned, and now they have become banned, right? And this actually reverberates what we saw in the instructions prior to the attack on Jericho. If we recall, in verse 18, Joshua instructs, right, that the city shall be devoted. In other words, will be put as a cherem, will be consecrated, right? It and all that is in it to the Lord, right? Everything has to be given to the Lord. And then there's a warning that Joshua makes. And only you keep yourselves from the devoted, the consecrated thing, the banned thing, lest you make yourselves banned, condemned, when you take of the devoted, consecrated things, and make the camp of Israel a ruin, and trouble it, or sally it. All these descriptions are very evident in our chapter, and obviously this is a setup for what happens, right? This prohibition that Joshua announces, taking from the consecrated things to God, will make the Israelites consecrated, and then will eventually bring trouble and tarnish Israel, and bring ruin upon Israel and destruction. And this is exactly what occurs here, and this is what God now repeats, right? I will not be with you because now you have become banned, right? And you will, and so long as you hold on to those banned things which were supposed to be consecrated to God, I will not be with you. So now Joshua is made aware, and we learn from this that there's no double standard. In other words, God is with Israel, but God's being with Israel is conditioned upon Israel being loyal to God. And in this instance, because Israel was unfaithful, therefore God says, I will not be with you. Right? There are no free tickets here, and Israel is now punished, just like all peoples are punished if they sin against God. Israel doesn't get any special treatment. If anything, it has a harsher treatment here. And because they transgressed, they took part of the loot, at least Achan took part of the loot from Jericho. Therefore, God was not with them. So now, after informing Joshua about what happened, he once again instructs him. Verse 13, arise. Once again, that key word, kum, rise up. It's not time for falling on your face, right, for grieving. Rise up. Prepare the people. This is not the best translation. I would prefer sanctify, kadesh etam. Sanctify the people and say, sanctify yourselves for tomorrow. For thus says the Lord God of Israel, there is a banned thing, right? The cherem bekirbecha, the accursed or the banned thing, right? There is a banned thing in you, in your midst, O Israel. You will not be able to stand. Again, the verb lakum, fourth time. Lakum. You will not be able to stand before your enemies until you remove the accursed or banned thing from among you. So here we have the instructions for Joshua to rise up. Some of the words here are very reminiscent, once again, of the story of the crossing of the Jordan River in chapter 3. Take a look. The instruction to sanctify, right? Kadesh ta'am, for tomorrow. Sanctify yourselves for tomorrow in preparation. We see the Hebrew, not the best translation. Sanctify yourselves for tomorrow, right? And why? Because the Lord of Israel is going to do something, right, in amongst you. And notice this, in your midst, bekirbecha. The word sanctify for tomorrow and the word bekirbecha are words that appeared in Joshua chapter 3 when they crossed the Jordan. Let's take a look, right, at the instructions that were given to Joshua. Look at verse 5. We'll see the Hebrew and then translate. Translated. And Joshua said unto the people, prepare yourselves for tomorrow. Another, once again, should be translated preferably, sanctify yourselves for tomorrow. The Lord will do wonders among you. Among you, it's in your midst. It's the same word, bekirbehem, in your midst, right? So it's very ironic here because we have similar wording. In both instances, we have a command to sanctify in preparation for tomorrow because God's going to do something very outstanding the following day. But of course, tremendous difference. With regard to the crossing the Jordan in chapter 3, this was a miraculous event for the benefit of Israel, right? A reward of bringing them into the land of Israel. Whereas in our instance, it's more in the lines of a punishment. Sanctify yourself because great wonders will be seen tomorrow, but not as a reward, but rather as a punishment for the sins that were perpetrated. So the idea here is that if you take from something which is devoted to God, that kind of makes you parallel to that object. If you don't recognize that this is something that is not yours, it belongs, it's off limits, and you basically cross that boundary, you become kind of off limits. And that's the idea. I don't think it has to be viewed as something contagious as much as a conceptually, right, crossing a boundary and now becoming part of what is devoted and consecrated to God. You've crossed that limit, you've connected with it. Now you basically lose your rights for yourselves because this is now devoted to God. Now here are the continuing instructions. Verse 14. In the morning, therefore, you shall be brought near according to your tribes, and it shall be that the tribe which the Lord takes shall come near by families, and the family which the Lord takes shall come near by households, and the household which the Lord takes shall come near man by man. So in other words, it's apparently going to be done in some kind of a graded lot system, and it's not really explained how it was done, but what we understand is it was a gradual kind of process of discovering who was responsible, starting from the largest organizing component, the tribe, right? And then going down from the tribe to families, households, and finally, all right, the actual man by man lot to discover who is responsible. And it shall be, he that is taken with the accursed thing, namely with the banned objects, shall be burnt with fire, he and all that he has, because he has transgressed the covenant of the Lord, right? Again, we have that verb avar, transgressed the covenant of the Lord, because he has wrought an infamous deed in Israel, He has done something horrible within Israel. So the punishment is that he shall be burnt. Where do they get that idea of burning, right? With fire, right? Burnt with fire. Well, that was what was done actually to the city of Jericho, right? If we return to Jericho 6, right? What did they do? In verse 24, and they burnt the city with fire and all that was in it. Only the silver and the gold and the vessels of copper, whatever they couldn't burn, the metals, they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. But everything that they could, everything that was alive, they burnt in fire. And that's kind of the manner in which it was devoted to God. No human could benefit from it. So that's what's going to befall the person who took from those devoted things. We move on to the fulfillment of the instructions by Joshua, beginning in verse 16. And Joshua rose up early in the morning. This, of course, is another connection to the chapter of the crossing of the Jordan, which we saw. Chapter 3 begins with Joshua rising up in the morning, and Joshua rose up early in the morning. This is chapter 3. So we have all these parallels between what happened, the great miracle of the crossing of the Jordan, preparing, sanctifying yourself, because God is going to be performing a miracle amongst you. So we have the same thing happening here. Again, Joshua waking up in the morning, the nation being sanctified in preparation, but of course, totally different in the focus of what is about to happen. So Joshua rises up in the morning and brought Israel near by their tribes. So basically, you had the 12 tribes, and we had to discover, and the tribe of Judah was taken, right? Vayilaked, it was taken is not the best kind of captured, right? The tribe of Judah. Verse 17, and he brought near the family of Judah, and he took the family of the Zarahites, Zarchi. And he brought the family of the Zarahites near man by man, and Zavdi was taken. And he brought his household near man by man, and Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerach of the tribe of Judah, was taken, was selected, was kind of captured. All right, so we here have the lengthy description, stage by stage, from tribe, from family, household, and finally specific man. And of course, this connects us with the opening verse of the story, where we had the whole description of the pedigree, the ancestry of Achan, right? Achan, son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerach. So here, by lot, we discover that it is he indeed who was taken, what we knew all along, and now Joshua discovers. Now Joshua moves to speak to Achan. And Joshua said to Achan, my son, give, I pray you, glory to the Lord God of Israel, and make confession to him. Not the best translation. The Hebrew here says veten lo todah. Literally, it would be, I would translate the whole phrase as follows: Simna kavod, put glory, right? Not give. Put, I pray you, glory to the Lord, and give confession to him. And by the way, notice the words being chosen here. It's not say a confession, right? Confess. It's give a confession. Todah here doesn't mean thank you, but rather means to confess, with hodot, right? To confess. So give him, right? Put for him a respect, and give him the usage of these verbs of putting, giving, I think hints. What does Joshua want? Hand over the goods that you took, right? It's not only confess orally, but also hand them over, give them over. And tell me now what you have done. Do not hide anything from me. So now Achan is faced with this predicament here. He's being charged with having taken. How will he respond? So we move on to his response. Verse 20. And Achan answered Joshua and said, "Indeed, I have sinned against the Lord God of Israel, and thus have I done." So he confesses, first of all, right? And then he elaborates. In verse 21, "And I saw among the spoils a goodly Babylonian garment, right? A special style garment, a suit from Shinar, which is Babylon, right? It would be tantamount, let's say, to saw a very high class Italian suit, okay, nowadays. So I saw something very special, a special garment from Babylon, a goodly garment. Aderet Shinar tova, goodly. Oops, right? And he continues on, and 200 shekels of silver. Here, shekel means weight measurement, right? Lishkol, it's to measure. It's not like the actual coin, but rather a weight measurement. 200 shekels of silver, and a wedge of gold. Literally, it's a tongue of gold, probably some brick of gold, right? And a wedge of gold, 50 shekels weight. So I also saw silver, I also saw gold. Then I coveted them, right? That's the translation of va'echmedem. I coveted them and took them. And then finally I took them, va'ekachem. And behold, they are hidden in the earth in the midst of my tent. They are hidden, buried there in my tent, munim, right? Hidden, concealed in the midst of my tent, and the silver under it. And the 200 shekels, the heavy weight of silver is below those smaller objects, the clothing and the gold. So first of all, we see from the description the aspect of coveting, right? The greed here. He knows exactly what he has. He knows their weight, the very specific quantitative description, 200 shekels and 50 shekels of gold, right? The source of the garment from Shinar, from Babylon. That very specific description, I think, kind of highlights his greed and coveting, right? He knows exactly the amounts. I think it's kind of highlights that aspect, that materialism, right? The aspect of focusing on quantitative descriptions, amounts, right? Highlights his materialism. I think when we read this verse also, there's another famous verse that comes to mind. A verse that appears very early in the Bible. In fact, in the first story about sin, and I'm referring to the story of the sin in the Garden of Eden. We compare Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden, we can find very similar language. And what's amazing is not only do we find the same words, but they're even in the same order. Both sins begin with seeing. When I saw among the spoils, and the woman saw, vatere, va'ere. Notice the similar verbs, right? This in the feminine and third person, she saw, and I saw, va'ere. And what did he see? A goodly Babylonian garment. What did the woman see? She was good, right? Same word, tov, tova in the yellow. We continue later on. What else did she see? That the tree was desirable to make one wise. V'nechmad, that's the same root. Va'echmedem, then I desired them. And finally, va'ekachem, I took them just like Vatikach, she took of its fruit. It's very interesting. I see here a purposeful analogy, right? I think it's quite clear. Same words, same ordering, one can see. Why? Why does the author here want to connect between these two sins? Well, for starters, they're both beginnings, right? Starting openings. Right, we have the opening story pretty much of human sin in the Garden of Eden, And this is like a new start. They're entering the land of Israel, which may be parallel to the Garden of Eden. And here too, we have the opening sin, the first sin. So maybe on one hand, the parallel was brought about because of their being both sins being firsts in the description. And beyond that, both sins are quite similar because in both instances, we have kind of a transgression, not respecting boundaries. Because Eve, Chava, she took from the fruit which was off limits to humans. Everything was permissible, but this was off limits, this tree, right? But she didn't respect, she transgressed into the divine sphere, right? Taking what was beyond, right, her right. And so too here, what do we see with Achan doing the same thing? And in both instances, they fall due to their being attracted and coveting things which weren't meant to be theirs. And hence, I think this interesting connection between two basically transgressions and sins which begin a chain of events. And of course, this may also have within it a hidden danger, because what was the outcome of the sin in the Garden of Eden? They were expelled from the garden. Perhaps what's behind this analogy is also a warning that if the Israelites do not keep the rules and do not hand over what was not rightfully theirs, then they too risk the punishment of being expelled themselves from the Garden of Eden. So that is the description here and the interesting analogy with the sin in the Garden of Eden. And we continue now with our story in chapter 7. So Achan confessed, and now we read in verse 22, and Joshua sent messengers, and they ran to the tent, and behold, it was hidden in the tent, and the silver under it, exactly as he described. The silver was underneath, precisely as Achan said. And they took them from the midst of the tent, so they carried over all the objects and brought them to Joshua and all of the children of Israel, and laid them out before the Lord. The Hebrew is vayatzikum, right? Letzeket, not only laid them out, kind of poured them out before the Lord. The verb yatzak, to pour out, is usually used in relation to libations, oil libations in the sacrificial cult and in the worship of God. So this may be purposely chosen, right? This is something which belongs to God, and therefore, just like you pour out the oil, the olive oil, on as a libation, part of the sacrifices. So here they present all the objects that belong to the Lord. Notice that verb vayikachum, they took them from the tent, right? Which here, right, vayikachum, and they took them, which is exactly the same verb, lakach, to take, is what was described by Achan, that he took, right? Vaychmedem va'ekachem, I took them. And now in response, vayikachum, now they take them back. The messengers that Joshua sent take them back because and they found them, right? They indeed found them hidden, right, concealed, tamun, underneath in the tent. And this brings us to the conclusion, right? We have the evidence, we have a confession, right? It's very clear. God has uncovered the source of the sin which has brought the downfall of Israel. Verse 24. And Joshua and all Israel with him took Achan, the son of Zerach, and the silver, and the garment, and the wedge of gold, and his sons, and his daughters, and his ox, and his ass, and his flock, and his tent, and all that he had. And they brought them up to the valley of Achor. So they took him to a valley called Achor, valley of Achor, which is a verb we've already seen. Achor is to sally, to taint, right? Usually translated as trouble, right? And Joshua said, why have you troubled us, right? Me'achartanu, right? That same root, achal, achol, it's the same root. I would translate preferably sullied, tarnished us, right? Why have you troubled us, tarnished us? The Lord shall trouble you this day, right? Hashem. So what you have done now, God will bring back upon you. He will tarnish you. He will bring trouble upon you. The Lord shall trouble you this day. And all Israel stoned him with stones and burned them with fire. After they had stoned them with stones, this is an attempt to solve, because literally it says, and stone them again. It could be that the double stoning, notice this is in brackets after, could be that they stoned them and then they burnt them and they covered them. The second stoning is actually covering them up with a heap of stones, kind of as a memorial for what has happened. So they performed the punishment, and the conclusion, verse 26, and they raised over him a great heap of stones to this day, like a kind of cairn, signifying their location. So the Lord turned from the fierceness of his anger. Therefore, the name of that place was called the Valley of Achor to this day, the Valley of Sullying, right, of trouble, to this day, based on what happened and what occurred. So we can see here the punishment, a very harsh punishment. But before we get to analyzing its nature, first, just as far as the name Achor and the parallel to the name Achan, there seems to be a word play here when Joshua kind of plays on his name. He takes Achan, right, to the valley of Achor, and then says, Me'achartanu yakercha, you who have sallied us, troubled us, the Lord shall trouble you. It's interesting, and the location is called the Valley of Achor, right? And it's interesting because later on in the Bible, in Chronicles, where they have a lineage of the different tribes and different families, so Achan is actually called Achar, right? Take a look in Chronicles, chapter 2, verse 7. And the sons of Carmi, Achar, the troubler of Israel, right? Achar, Ocher Israel. His name has transposed from Achan to Achar, paralleling the wordplay of Achor, Achan, similar sounding words. So he becomes a symbol of he was sullied, who has brought great troubles upon his people. Now we see what happens as far as the punishment is concerned, is not only is Achan punished, but he took Achan, but also, and all the spoils that Achan had taken, right? The silver, the gold, and the garment, but also all his children, sons and daughters, all his animals, and even his belongings, his tent, everything that he had. And they obviously stone them and then burn them, right? Like I said, this parallels what they were supposed to do to the city of Jericho. But the question that arises, well, okay, Achan sinned, and I understand he should be punished, but why that harsh and horrifying punishment of his whole family, his children? And this question indeed troubled even the sages, and different opinions have been raised, even amongst the Chazal, the Jewish sages of the first centuries. And one opinion actually states that only Achan was actually killed. This appears in the Babylonian Talmud, in the tractate Sanhedrin, in page 44 on the first leaf. It says that only Achan himself was killed. Why did they bring the children? In order to educate them and see what happens when you sin. But I don't think that fits too well with the verses, because with the verses, I think the simple reading is that they were all stoned, right? And all Israel stoned him with stones and burnt them with fire, right? And they had stoned them with stones. So even an alternative possible explanation of the double stoning could be that first they punished him, Achan, and stoned him, and then his children afterwards were stoned. So while the sages were very troubled and wanted to take it in the direction that no, the children were not really killed, only Achan was, I think that is not justified in simple reading the pshat of the text. A different possible explanation, once also raised by the sages, this time in a different source called Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. It's a homiletic interpretation of the book of Genesis. So in chapter 38, we read there the question: how could it be that the children were also punished? There's an explicit command in Hebrew, lo yumtu avot al banim. Parents and sons shall not be punished together, right? Parents shouldn't be punished for their children's sins, and vice versa, right? Children shouldn't be punished for their parents' sins. So how come here God commands that they should all be punished? And the answer that the sages give in this source is because they knew, the children knew, they were part of the scheme, right? They helped hide, conceal, right? And they did not dissuade their father and tell him to return what was taken. And therefore they're part of the crime. That was the proposal in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, the second possible explanation. It's interesting to read there that they want to tone down the punishment for Achan, because he actually did confess at the end. And therefore, that interpretation focuses on the text and says, notice, what did Joshua say in verse 25? Why have you troubled us? The Lord shall trouble you this day. So they focus on this day, right? The Yakech Hashem Bayom Hazeh, this day. And then the sages infer from this, okay, you will be punished now, but not in the world to come. The next world you do inherit, right? The world to come. They wanted to, I guess, ease on the punishment of Achan, because we do at least see him confessing and indeed seemingly showing remorse and understand that he sinned against God. And therefore, even the harsh punishment is only here, but he actually has merit in the world to come. That's in the words of the sages. So that's another possible explanation, that the children were involved and therefore worthy of punishment. But even if we don't go in that direction, the truth is, I think that we're relating to divine judgment within with a human perspective. It's true that the Torah forbids punishing, parents for their children's sin and says everyone has to be punished for his own sin, but that's in reference to human judgment. The question is that really the case in divine judgment? Because I believe in divine judgment, maybe it's done differently, and God sees the relationship between generations, and his perspective is totally different from the human perspective, and hence when we're talking about divine punishment here, obliged upon Joshua and the Israelites, there we do see generations suffering from previous generations, right, wiping out totally the whole family of Achan. That's what I think really indeed is understood in the simple reading of the verse. So why is it such a harsh punishment? Why do we need also everything that he has, all his belongings, all his animals, right? So here, of course, the answer is very simple, because this is exactly what was to be done in Jericho, right? The punishment was that they should all be wiped out, including all their belongings, all the animals, all the livestock, even the land was prohibited. And that's what happens with Achan, right? Everything it becomes banned, even his tent, everything that he had, all his animals are destroyed. In other words, what happens is he basically becomes like Jericho. he took from Jericho, and therefore he kind of crossed the boundary and became like the people of Jericho, and therefore is treated and suffers that same consequence as found upon the people of Jericho. I want to conclude with an interesting analogy that I think arises when we read the story of Achan. Not a simple story. There seems to be some parallels between the account of Achan and another character. We don't have too many characters in the book of Joshua, but we read about another character that I think we can find some parallels in comparison to Achan. I'm referring, of course, to Rachav, right? The prostitute who harbored and hid the messengers sent by Joshua in Joshua chapter 2, and was eventually saved, her and her whole family. The parallels are quite a few. First of all, in both instances, we have a contact with the messengers. The scouts come to Joshua and are hidden by Rachav. And we have here the messengers who come, who get the information from Achan and go to the tent. Furthermore, in both instances, and this is very interesting, we have the issue of concealing, right? And even the same verb used, the verb taman, right, to hide. So if you recall, Rahav, when she harbored the scouts, so she hid them and on her rooftop, right? And we have the same verb even in describing the concealment. In verse 6, I'll read the Hebrew. And she brought them up to the roof and she hid them, right? The same verb, vatitmenem, right? That's the verb used in Achan, on Achan's description, where he said that he hid them in the tent, Vehinam tmunim, right? In verse 21, verse 21 in our chapter 7, tmunim, they are hidden in the midst of the tent, right? So in both instances, we have the act of hiding. Furthermore, both characters are related to an effect on the spirits of the people, because Rahav indeed informed the spies of how the people, all the people of Jericho, their hearts have melted, right? And melt away, the same language. Vanishma vayimas levavenu, chapter 2, verse 11. Our hearts melted, and that's exactly the effect of the loss upon the Israelites. Right, right in the beginning of the chapter, their hearts melted, and the hearts of the people melted. Same wording exactly, right here. Vayimas levavam, their hearts melted in verse 5, right? And finally, the additional parallel is that both characters impact the plight of their family, because Rahav's family, her whole entire family, was saved because of Rahav. And on the flip side, we have Achan, whose whole family was destroyed as a consequence of his actions. So we have in both instances a character hiding, intervening, affecting the morale, all right, coming into contact with messengers. And in both instances, the result is not only upon the character himself, but rather on his entire family. Of course, in opposite ways, because Rahav manages to save her entire family, while Achan leads to the demise and destruction of his entire family. And what does this analogy really want to inform us? And here I think there's something quite surprising, because the story of the book of Joshua is not only a story about the conquest, it's also a story about the identity of the Israelites. It's a story of how the Israelites came and destroyed the Canaanite nations and settled in the land. And as a consequence, it also deals to a large extent in the distinction between the two. And even though there's a clear divide between the Israelites, the ones who are meriting the land, and the Canaanites who will be punished and destroyed, right? We see that this line is not impenetrable, because on the one hand, we see Rahab and her family crossing the lines from the Canaanites and joining and dwelling amongst the Israelites. On the flip side, we see Achan and his family having a similar fortune as the Canaanites themselves and being totally annihilated. And what's fascinating is that in both accounts, we have a description of their background. Rahab is described as a prostitute. In other words, the lowest of the low, right? In a sinful city of Jericho, she is the prostitute there. And Achan, we see the pedigree, the lineage emphasized, the son of Carmi, of Zabdi, from the tribe of Judah, a leading tribe, but an important character. What do we learn from this? With all due respect to pedigree and lineage, ultimately, God judges peoples by their actions. And you can be a prostitute from the sinful city of Jericho, but merit to be saved and even join and merge with the people of Israel. And on the flip side, you could be from the leading tribe of Israel, but if you sin, if you transgress, if you act greedily and don't respect the boundaries that God gives, then you will suffer the same fate as the Canaanites, because you are no different from those Canaanites. So the story concludes with a God finally being appeased by the actions. So we read the conclusion, and they raised over him a great heap of stones to this day. This is to commemorate the event, right? And this, of course, is also kind of paralleling the stones that were set up in commemoration of the crossing of the Jordan. So we remember miraculous events of how God intervened and helped us cross the Jordan. We also remember the sins and the punishment that were brought by God upon the people because of their sins, both instances using stones, right, to commemorate, and the conclusion. So the Lord turned from the fierceness of his anger, right? And of course, this parallels the beginning of the story, because the story begins by informing us, right? And the anger of the Lord was kindled against the children of Israel. And indeed, that brought horrific results and the loss of the war. But now, after things were rectified and the sinners were punished, right, then Israel no longer has that stain, and therefore God's anger has subsided. Therefore, the name of the place was called the Valley of Achor to this day. We can now move on and hopefully continue with the process of conquering the land, this time clean of sin. How will I eventually be conquered? That we shall find out in the following chapter.